Hello, welcome to Anatomy and Physiology 1. We are entering into the skeletal system, where we will spend the majority of our time looking at and considering factors of homeostasis as it relates to the function of bone as well as structure. Most of the structure is going to be a review of what we looked at when in lab when we talked about, well, lack of a better term, the structure of bone. Before we look at homeostasis and function of bone, let's consider what bones are used for. And so the two obvious functions of bone or what bone is good for is support and movement. And this is going to tie into our look at the muscular system. And that being the second function of bone, and that is muscle attachment. That's not all that they do, though. Bone and our skeletal system is much more than just support and movement and muscle attachment. We also see that bone is used as a storage facility for actually a couple different things. It's not just relegated and kind of left to just one thing. First thing, we find that bone serves as a storage for calcium. And we're going to talk more about that on the upcoming slides, but calcium is important. Calcium is important for muscle contraction, so it makes sense that our muscles have a close source of calcium to draw upon if needed. But calcium is also required for action potentials. And an action potential is basically a wave of electrical impulse that travels down a neuron. And we know that a neuron is the functional cell of the nervous system. And so that idea of really being able to store calcium has far greater implications than just it's what makes bone a hardened substance. That amorphous ground substance becomes hardened because of the calcium storage in excess. It is an in excess of calcium that is stored within that amorphous ground substance. Another function of the skeletal system is acid-base balance, regulating pH. How does it do that, you may ask? Well, it does that by buffering the blood. And so we know that blood has a very limited range of pH. The range, or the homeostatic range of blood, is 7.35 to 7.45 pH, with an average, we say, of 7.4. And so that doesn't leave a whole lot of room for error. And so bone can release carbonate. Right? So one of the things that stores, or one of the ways that we store calcium, is in a form called calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate. And that calcium carbonate can be released. The carbonate can be released in the form of carbonic acid. And when we release that carbonic acid, it can actually help to buffer or neutralize the blood, just like phosphate can actually buffer and neutralize the blood. And so here again, when we talk about acid-base balance, We're not just assuming that that acid-base balance is happening in the bone. That bone is regulating homeostasis outside of the skeletal system. Just like the calcium storage is not meant for bone necessarily, its primary focus is to support the nervous and muscular system. We also see as a function of the skeletal system storage of adipocytes. Now, going back to histology and chapter 4 in lecture, where we talked about tissue types, we know that adipocytes are a type of cell that we find within adipose tissue. Those adipocytes we find in high concentration in yellow bone marrow down the center of our long bones, what we call the medulla, right, in the shaft region of our long bones. So as we age, that bone marrow that is in the center of the long bones will transition from being red bone marrow into yellow bone marrow. It moves from the purpose of, or the intentional purpose of producing red blood cells, which is what happens in red bone marrow, to serving as a energy reserve as we age. And that is what the primary purpose of that yellow bone marrow is. And most of us have seen that yellow bone marrow. If you have a dog at home and you've ever given your dog a bone from the supermarket, and they spend hours taking that tongue and putting it down the center of the bone, trying to lick and bite and grab and pull that 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 greasy yellow-hued substance in the middle of the bone. That's yellow bone marrow, and that is what is inside of our bones as we age. And age does not mean elderly. It does not mean geriatric. Elderly or aged here simply means past the age of, I would say, on a range of 18 to 23. Right? Once we hit our mid-20s, we have completed that transition from having red bone marrow to yellow bone marrow in the shafts of our bone. Which brings me to the last point that is on this slide. Hematopoiesis. Hematopoiesis, and sorry, I have to laugh looking at the translation that's going on with um, the talk to text that's coming up at the bottom of the screen. I apologize for any misinterpretation that may come as that is scrolling across the bottom. Please be patient with that in all of these videos. Back to hematopoiesis. Hematopoiesis is the production or the process of the production of red blood cells. And hematopoiesis occurs within red bone marrow. So during infancy, childhood, toddler, adolescence, during those various stages of development, our long bones had red bone marrow, as did the ends of our long bones, as did our flat bones, the cranial bones, the sternum, the rib, the ribs, the pelvic bones, all right, as well as our vertebrae, all contain red bone marrow. Scapula is another flat bone that would contain red bone marrow. Well, throughout our life, those flat bones maintain red bone marrow. But what we end up seeing is the ends, or I should say, the shaft of the long bones transition from being red bone marrow to yellow bone marrow, or going from supporting hematopoiesis, the production of red blood cells, to serving as a reservoir of energy. Now, I mentioned a little bit here about the ground substance that is found in bone. And just as a word, that we're going to focus on the ground substance, but fibers also play an important role. And of course, the main fiber that we are dealing with is that of collagen. All around that collagen, the amorphous ground substance becomes hardened. And it becomes hardened due to the absorption of mineral salts. These are salts that have an additional ion that is attached in the form of a mineral. Generally, that mineral is calcium. And so this is why calcium is so important in our diets, not from the production or the consumption of milk, but truly dietary calcium is important because they bind with these salts to form these mineral salts. That helps to harden the ground substance. Hydroxyapatite is one of those mineral salts. Hydroxyapatite is a fancy name for, it's a fancy name. Hold on one second here, guys. Hydroxyapatite is a fancy name for calcium phosphate. Right. Now, the other major calcium salt that is present is calcium carbonate, which we know plays a major role in helping to maintain and regulate pH. It acts as a buffer. But you can see that there's other types of minerals that are also important here. Magnesium, hydroxide, fluoride, sulfate are also other supporting minerals. Let's get back to this idea of collagen being kind of infused throughout this amorphous ground substance. So if you've ever passed by a construction site where they're laying the foundation, you very often see them using cinder blocks as the foundation. And those cinder blocks have holes in the middle. And so the solid edges of the cinder blocks are faced inward and outward, and being stacked upon one another are the ends of the cinder blocks that have these holes in there. And if you've ever strolled by and taken a look, very often you will find metal rods that are going through the center of the cinder blocks. We call that rebar. And that rebar is there down the center to help strengthen the foundation. How? Good question. The how is they will pour concrete down and around that rebar going through the center of the cinder blocks. As the concrete hardens, the rebar provides more surface area for the concrete to bind and attach to, which is going to increase its stability. It's going to increase its ability to provide support for the structure that is going to go on top of the foundation. Where our skeletal system is planned out pretty much the same way. That collagen acts as a strengthening agent for the calcified matrix. So as the amorphous ground substance becomes harder, it is binding to, it is attaching to those collagen fibers. And as it attaches to those collagen fibers, it helps to increase the integrity and the strength of the bone. Now, I'm going to kind of introduce these four cells here that you see, and then we're going to stop My goal is to create 15 to 20 minute presentations, so small chunks of information for you to absorb, with some questions built out as we go along. And so what you see in front of you are the 4 cells that are associated with bone. And we're going to talk about these 4 cell types a little bit more in the next video. And the um, homeostatic mechanisms, aka negative feedback mechanisms, that regulate when these 4 cell types are functioning. So the 4 cell types are osteoprogenitor cells, osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. And just as a point of reference, osteoprogenitor cells are the cells, kind of think of these as being undifferentiated stem cells. And so these are cells that will or have the ability to change and differentiate into other cell types. And what directs their differentiation is hormones. In comes negative feedback. Osteoblasts are cells that are bone cells that engage in the production of new bone. They lay down new amorphous ground substance that is hardened within the osteon themselves. Once there is no new bone to lay down, the osteoblasts differentiate and become osteocytes. And so osteocytes maintain the new bone that has been laid down and produced by the osteoblasts. And then lastly, we have osteoclasts. Osteoclasts actually are not a part of the bone lineage. They're not really part of the bone family. Osteoclasts are cells that belong to the macrophage lineage. And as they are part of the macrophage lineage, their job is to break down and degrade bone. And so as the bone wears out, it is broken down by osteoclasts. And so again, just kind of real quick as a reminder, these osteoblasts that you see right there, the osteoblasts, that ending there, blast, B-L-A-S-T, that means to produce. And what they're producing is osteo. They're producing new bone. Cytes, S-Y-T-E-S. Osteocytes are bone cells that behave like bone cells. And their job is to maintain the bone. And then lastly, osteoclasts. And those osteoclasts, that ending clast, C-L-A-S-T, means to break down. And so osteoclasts are macrophages that engage in the breaking down of bone. And so we're going to stop there. Kind of let you digest these last few slides that we have talked about. And once you are done that and you are comfortable with this material, absolutely, I want you to kind of come back in, preview the next video here, and try to get a good understanding of what is happening with the negative feedback mechanisms that regulates both the production of and the breaking down of bone. And on that note, we will catch you guys on the other side of our short little break.